Okay. So, for those of you that are struggling with some of these Mendelian questions, let's just do, I don't know, 3 or 4 practice ones, and then I'm going to end up with that question 6B from the packet I gave you, just to redo it. I did it really quick on the board. So I just kind of want to do it over again. But let's use those same genes. So in that question 6B that I gave you, there were 3 gene sets. And when I say gene sets, I'm talking about the alleles that code for one gene. Okay? For instance, we're going to use big T for tall. And I'm going to use different colors for different gene sets. So the big T is an allele. The little t is an allele. The big T is a dominant allele for tall. The little t, let's say, is a small recessive allele that codes for dwarf. So, in other words, if you have any amount, 1 or 2 big T's in your genes, you're going to be tall, right? For this plant is going to be a tall plant. Those are the, let's call them the size gene. Okay, so there's one gene that's just for size. There's 2 alleles. That's the tall allele. That's the dwarf allele. Okay, so far so good. Let me just make this a little bit more visual. Let's say that this is on a chromosome. This is in P's. These are P genes, right? In a P. This is, let's say, the chromosome that it exists on. Well, let's say that this is chromosome number 2. Okay? If the big T gene is here, the little t gene is in the exact same locus. Locus is the place on a chromosome where a gene sits. There's 2 versions of it, and the versions of a gene are called alleles. So that's the big T dominant tall allele, and this is the little t dwarf allele for the same gene. The gene is the size gene. A little bit further along the way, we're going to use big Y for another allele. This is for yellow pod color in P's. So the pod itself, the outside coating of the P covering is yellow. The recessive version of that is green. Okay? It's a little bit backwards from what you think it is, because it's actually a green color is recessive rather than dominant, which is normally you think it's probably going to be a dominant gene. So in any case, this one here, this set, is not the size gene. This is what's called the color gene. Okay, color gene. All right. On another chromosome, let's call this, I don't know, we'll call this chromosome number 5. Let's say it's on chromosome number 5. Okay, somewhere on chromosome number 5, let's say halfway down, this one has the big Y and this one has a little y. Okay? Those are alleles to each other. They're in the same locus, on the same chromosome number, but this particular gene, the color gene, has 2 versions. It has a yellow version and a green version, all right? And then the last one that we had to deal with in that question was the big R allele and the little r allele. The big R is the dominant version for a round seed. Okay, so the seed comes out round. The little r is a recessive version of that same gene that causes, for various reasons, the seed to turn out wrinkled. So this seed kind of turns out to be this dried up, wrinkly looking thing. All right. So this is a third completely different gene, not related to the others in any way. They don't cross, they don't mix, they don't blend, they don't do anything with each other. They're on different chromosomes even. And so this is what we're going to refer to as the seed shape gene. Seed shape gene. Okay? Gene size or size gene, the color gene, and the seed shape gene. These are 3 completely different genes. And in fact, They're on 3 entirely different chromosomes, okay? Somewhere on chromosome number 10, there is a big R, or possibly in the same locus, a little r, okay? So we have all of these different genes. Let me give you an example. Let's say we have a chromosome number 5, chromosome number 5. We've got chromosome number 2 up here, right? And then we've got chromosome number 10 down here. And let's say this is metaphase 1 of meiosis in some cell. These things are going to line up, they're going to separate, and they're going to make sex cells, right? So when you determine what sex cell has what allele to a chromosome, all you have to know is what the original genotype of that parent cell was. So let's start out with something super simple, okay? Let's just start out with the purple gene, the tall versus dwarf, okay? So let's say that I have a homozygous dominant parent. Let's say this is the female parent plant. And we're going to mix that with a, I kind of screwed up. So let's say that I'm going to mix that with a heterozygous male plant, okay? So these, I'm going to cross these two, and what I need to do then is to determine what is the phenotypic frequency or ratio of the offspring. Okay? You know that big T is dominant, so anytime there's a big T, there's going to be a tall plant. Little t is dwarf, so anytime there's a little t, it may not be a dwarf plant unless there's 2 little t's. You have to have both of them. It's got to be pure little t for it to actually become a dwarf plant. All right? So let's put the sex cells down here. Sex cells of this one, 100% big T. Right? This plant is always making big T's. This one, the male plant, is making big T's half the time for sperm cells, and he's making little t's half the time for sperm cells, right? So now you just have to fill in, well, what are all of the possible offspring? If that sperm and that egg come together, big T, big T. If this sperm and that egg come together, big T, big T. If this sperm and that egg come together, big T, little t. Okay? Now I've got 2 big T's down here. I've got a little t here, right? If this sperm and that egg come together, big T, little t. So far, so good? What we end up with is 100% tall plants, because every one of them is showing the dominant trait. Okay, so every single one of those is going to be a tall plant. So far? All right, now the chances of there being a short plant with these 2 parents is 0%. You can't have a short plant. But let's go on a little bit farther. Let's just say we have 2 heterozygous tall plants are crossed. That's how the questions are going to be asked on the quiz. 2 heterozygous tall plants are crossed. What is the phenotypic and, just for good measure, genotypic ratio? Okay, so these are 2 different ratios. Phenotype are the ones how they look. How many tall and short ones are there? Genotypic is, well, what are the genotypes? What do they have? Are they heterozygous? Are they homozygous dominant? Are they homozygous recessive? All right? Okay, so going back to the traits, tall versus dwarf, big T equals tall. Little t equals dwarf. These are alleles on the same chromosome number, but they have different versions of that particular trait. Okay, so the question says two heterozygous tall plants. Okay, so they're tall because they have a big T. They're heterozygous because they have a little t as well. Okay, so that's the heterozygous tall. And that's a heterozygous tall plant. So far, I'm going to put this on a Punnett square, very simple. This is what's called a monohybrid cross because there is one trait in question. A dihybrid cross is when you're looking at two different traits and so on and so forth. We're going to make sex cells. Let's say that's the female plant and this is the male plant. We're going to put his sex cells over here. It doesn't matter if it's top or side. You just have to display the possible sex cells. This male plant can make big T's half the time, that's that one, and it can make little t's half the time. And the reason why that's true is because when chromosome number 2 divides, they divide evenly into different sex cells. So big T is going to go one way, little t is going to go the other way, and they're going to end up in different sex cells, right? So big T's over here, little t's over here, and that's going to be in a 50-50 ratio. You're going to have an even number of both of those. Same thing here. The male makes big T's half the time and little t's half of the time. If this sperm cell, well, where are the sperm cells? The sperm cells are over here. If this sperm comes together with that egg, you get a double dominant tall plant. If this sperm and that egg get together, you get a heterozygous plant. If this sperm and that egg get together, again, you get a heterozygous plant. If little t and little t come together, little t come together, I get my first homozygous recessive plant. Okay? So first of all, let's talk about the phenotypic ratio. Phenotypes. All three of these are going to be tall because they all have the dominant trait, right? So they're all going to be tall. So there's going to be 3 tall ones. And then this guy down here is going to be short. Okay? There's going to be 1 short one. So there's a 3 tall to 1 short ratio. This is the phenotypic ratio. That's what they're going to look like. Okay? So for instance, when this couple of plants get together, 25% of the little offspring are going to be short plants. 25%. Every one of these corners is 25% of the whole thing. All right? So 75% of them are going to be tall. 25% are going to be short. Now let's talk about the genotypes. The genotypic ratio is going to be a little bit different because there's actually 3 genotypes. There's big T, there's big T, and there's little t. Okay, so there's the big T. For every one of those, there's going to be 2 of those, and there's only going to be 1 of those. So the genotypic ratio is a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. The phenotypic ratio is a 3 to 1 ratio because all of these are going to be tall because all of them show the tall allele, right? And it's dominant. The only one that's going to be short is that one that's double recessive. This one's going to show the recessive trait. All right? That's what we call a monohybrid cross. Monohybrid. Because we're mixing one gene's alleles and that's it. It's all about how many genes there are. Very quickly, let's do a dihybrid cross. Okay? In a dihybrid cross, we're going to use two traits. Let's use the purple tall dwarf. Okay, so big T versus little t. Tall dwarf. About wrote short dwarf. And let's use yellow versus yellow. Oh yeah, that's not yellow. That's yellow. Tall, the dominant yellow. And this is green. Okay? So in other words, big W is the yellow allele. Big Y is the yellow allele. Little y is the green allele. All right? So we're going to look at these simultaneously in one cross. All right. Let's just make this interesting, shall we? Let's just say that I have 2 parents that are heterozygous for both traits. There's mom, call this mom, and let's call this Dad. He's heterozygous for tall too. Let's say that the yellow gene is also heterozygous for both of these plants. So these are both, to look at these plants, they are both tall and yellow. What you can't tell by looking at them is they are heterozygous for both traits, right? So this is a tall yellow plant, that's a tall yellow plant, but what you can't see is this hidden bunch of recessive alleles. You can't see the little t and the little y's in either one of these, all right? So what we want to know is, let's make this one easy. Let's say we want to know the phenotypic ratio. We can do this in two ways. We can separate it into two problems, which is the easiest way, or you can make one big group, okay? For right now, I'm not going to do the 16 square, which is a potential, but I'm going to do the simple way of doing it. So I'm going to divide this into two different problems, okay? I'm going to have a tall short problem, and I'm going to have a yellow-green problem. It just makes a lot more sense, because then you can do the ratios on the back end rather than figuring it out along the way. All right, so let's look at the parents with regard to the purple gene, the tall dwarf. This female makes big T's half the time and little t's half the time. The male makes big T's half the time and little t's half the time, because that's their genes, right? And when they make sex cells, they have an even chance of either sending one of those alleles to their sperm cell or egg cell versus the other one. It's an even chance. So let's just look at the phenotypes, because that's what my answer wants to be. This one's going to be tall, right? This one's going to be tall too, because it's big T, little t, right? That's big T, big T. This one's going to be tall because it's big T, little t. And this one's going to be short, little t, little t. So there is a 3 out of 4 chance that there's going to be a tall plant, right? And there is a 1 out of 4 chance there's going to be a dwarf plant. So far, so good? Good enough for right now. Let's move on to the yellow versus green gene. This female plant puts yellow's big Y's out and little Y's out equally. Same thing with the male plant. He makes big Y's half the time and little Y's half the time. This is going to be a yellow plant. This is going to be a yellow plant. This is going to be a yellow plant. And this is going to be a green recessive plant, because it has nothing but little Y's, little y, right? So in other words, there's a 3 out of 4 chance, 1, 2, 3, to have a green one. I'm sorry, that's stupid. A yellow one, right? And there is a 1 out of 4 chance to have a green one down here in the corner, all right? So, here's the trick. You have to write down all the possible babies that you can get. I'm going to write them out over here on the side. I could have, and this is all the combinations of babies you can possibly have. You could have a tall / yellow plant. It's going to be a common one because those are both the dominant traits, right? That's going to be the most easy plant to get. You could have a tall green plant. That's going to be a little harder to get because the green is a recessive version, right? I could have a dwarf yellow plant, because yellow is the other dominant, okay? That's going to be a little harder to get. And then the hardest one to get by far is going to be dwarf, because that's a recessive, and green, double recessive, okay? All we have to figure out is what the overall ratio is of the possibility of getting those. This one's going to be by far the easiest because those are the dominant ones and they show up more often, because all you need is one of those alleles and you end up with that trait. So they're going to be super common. Here's how I'm going to do that. The chances of being tall is 3 out of 4. So far, so good. The chances of being yellow is 3 out of 4. The overall chance of having a tall yellow plant is 9. 3 times 3 is 9. 4 times 4 is 16. So out of the 16 possibilities, 9 of them are going to be tall and yellow. Okay? One more step. Tall versus green. In order to be tall, I'm going to get rid of this. In order to be tall, 3 out of 4. In order to be green, green's recessive, 1 out of 4. Okay? So in order to be tall and green, you're going to be multiply across. These are the individual or the combined probabilities. You just multiply them. 3 out of 16. So out of the 16 possibilities, 3 of these guys are going to be tall and green. So far, so good. Running out of room. What is the chance of being dwarf? Here's my dwarf one. 1/4. And yellow? Yellow's 3/4. Right? So again, that's going to be 3 out of 16. So there's going to be 3 out of 16 chance that there's going to be a dwarf yellow plant. Dwarf green's going to be super hard to get because both of those are recessives. You're going to have to get a plant that looks like this. Little t, little y, little y. Then you've got that plant. Well, what are the chances of that ever happening? Well, you're going to have a 1/4 of being dwarf and 1/4 of being green, right? So, in other words, there's only going to be a 1 out of 16 chance of that ever happening. 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. So you can have 16 offspring differences, but only one of them is going to be dwarf and green. Okay, this is what's called the phenotypic ratio of a dihybrid cross between two heterozygous parents. 9 to 3 to 3 to 1 is going to be a really common outcome for that kind of cross. All right, now just for fun, let's look at the trihybrid cross from question 6b on your homework. All right, so what we have is all 3 genes. We've already looked at tall, dwarf, yellow, green. We're going to add round versus wrinkled this time. Okay, this is what your question on 6b said. It said, what if the mother plant was big T, big Y, little y, big R, little r. And the father plant was big T, big Y, little y, big R, little r. In other words, heterozygous for all 3 traits. This is what's called, by the way, a trihybrid cross. Trihybrid. And that is because there's 3 completely different traits. And let me remind you that not only are these 3 different traits, they're 3 different traits on 3 different chromosome sets. And the reason why that's important is because they independently assort. When they separate during meiosis, they're all going their own ways, and they can mix and match in every possible combination. Okay? So this is slightly easier than it could have been because this one right here is big T. So that one's only making big T's. This one is making big Y, little y. So what I did was separate these and these and these into 3 completely different problems. And then I mixed them back together in the end to come up with the ratio. Just like I did last time, but in this case we're using 3 different traits. All right. The probability of having a tall plant is 100%. And the reason for that is because the mother plant, the first plant here, is double dominant. And so the double dominant plant is always making big T sex cells 100% of the time. And so every one of the offspring is going to be tall. So 4 out of 4 are going to be tall. Down here, big Y versus little y, big Y versus little y, we end up with that well-known 3 to 1 ratio, right? 3/4 of them are going to be yellow, 1/4 is going to be green. Round versus wrinkled, same thing. These guys are heterozygous in both parents. And so we set up this square as big R, little r, big R, little r. There's going to be a 1/4 chance of having the wrinkled recessive trait. So the question at the end of that problem said, how many offspring will be tall, yellow, and wrinkled? Rather than having to do the whole thing, they gave you sort of an easy out, which was, okay, we'll just figure out how many are tall, yellow, and wrinkled. Well, 4 out of 4 of them are going to be tall. 3 out of 4 of them are going to be yellow. and 1 out of 4 of them is going to be wrinkled. Okay, so all I have to do is add, multiply those together, and the individual probabilities multiplied together gives you the collective probability of all of those 3 things happening together. Okay, so when you figure out collective probability, or the overall probability of things happening concurrently, it's just the product of their individual probabilities. 4, 4, 3, 4, 1, 4. I multiply across 12 out of 64. So there's a 12 out of 64 chance of getting a tall, yellow, wrinkled plant. What would be better than that, however, would be to reduce this to its common denominator numeral, right? So 12 out of 64, if you reduce that, becomes 3/16. So 3 out of 16 of these are going to be tall, yellow, and wrinkled. Just for fun, just to show that you can do the same thing with decimals, I changed 4, 4 into 1, 3/4 into 75%, 1/4 into 25%, and if you multiply across, you still get the equivalent to 3/16, which is 19%. So in other words, 19% of the offspring between these individual parents are going to end up being tall, yellow, and wrinkled. All right? I'm just going to let you you probably ought to just put that on hold and just try to do that problem on your own. Hopefully that helped a little bit. And we'll see you on Thursday.